Governor, and State Commissioners. I'm Carlos Royal, and I'm here because of an overassessment of Century Apartments. Century was increased a whopping 36% from its 2018 assessment set by the State Board of Equalization last year. My net operating income went down 10% from 2018, not up. Century should not have been increased, but should have been reduced to its appraised market value of $3,500,000. Century should not have been targeted for an increase just because the state reduced its market value last year against the assessor's wishes. So who's right? The assessor at $6,952,700? Or the state's most noted and trusted MAI appraisers, Joe Eibach and Corey Cost, at $3,500,000. As we shall see, there are many factors that affect value, but in this case, expenses will be the ultimate key to which is right. Hint: what happens if income crashes 59%? Do expenses remain at 45% of income in such a crash? But before we get into actual expenses, let me point out that all apartments, other than the 7 corrected by the state last year, received 5 to 14% reductions for 2019, while Century was increased 36%. Century is the only apartment complex in Dickinson whose assessment for 2019 is still above its 2018 assessment. Now back to expenses. Century is an outlier in that it does not fit the assessor's mass appraisal model as demonstrated by its assessment corrections in 2017 and 2018. Century costs more to operate as a percent of income than any other apartment complex in Dickinson due to its size, age, and atypical amenities provided, such as pool, children's playground, dog park, heat, water, sewer, and garbage are all included. Century has more land, more open space, more landscape, more hardscape, more sidewalks, more driveways to maintain per unit than any other apartment complex in Dickinson. If normal apartment expenses are 40 to 45%, then Century should be 55 to 60%, or about 15% more in normal time. In bad times, expenses will be even higher as a percent of income. This chart shows a history of Century Apartments for the last 15 years. And it shows that basically only during the boom years were Century's expenses below 55%. It also shows that expenses are not tied directly to income as a fixed percentage rate, but in general, as income goes up, expenses as a percentage of income go down. And as income goes down, expenses as a percentage of income go up. Expenses are a function of cost and increase with inflation. Income, on the other hand, is a function of supply and demand and varies greatly based on market conditions. To think that expenses will remain at a fixed percent of income regardless of the income is a novice error. Actual expenses have inflated at an average rate of just 4.45% over the last 15 years. Even if we assume our expenses were too high back in 2004 and expenses should have been only 45% instead of 55% of income, or $311,498, those reduced expenses, inflated to today, would still be $598,894, or 76% of 2019's reduced income. It is not reasonable or even logical to think that expenses would remain at 45% when income has fallen 59% from 2014 to 2019. In 2014, the peak year of the apartment boom, I collected $1,315 per unit at Century. I paid $464 per unit in expenses, or about 35%, and I made $851 per unit. In 2019, after the crash had bottomed, or 5 years later, I collected just $545 per unit at Century. I paid $508 per unit in expenses, or 93%, and I made just $38 per unit, or a little less than the $42 per unit I made in 2018. This chart shows that expenses have basically remained in line with inflation over the last 15 years. The issue is the assessor wants you to believe that 45% expenses are not only reasonable, but are tied directly to income, even when income declines 59%. It just doesn't work that way. If a steer cost $464 to raise in 2014, and you sell it for $1,350 due to strong demand, your expenses are 35%. But if a steer cost $508 to raise in 2019, and you sell it for just $545 due to weak demand and oversupply, your expenses are 93%. Just because the price of a steer goes down due to an oversupply of steers does not mean the rancher's expenses will go down. The same is true with apartment expenses. Apartment expenses have almost nothing to do with income. Utility companies, for example, don't care what I rent an apartment for, and neither do repair and supply contractors. The assessor is wrong to use a standard 45% for expenses when income has crashed 59%. It is not logical, nor is it reasonable. The assessor's presentation. The first issue we see is the assessor has used 45% expenses, which are about $79,000 less than Century's expenses in 2008, when Century had similar income. Expenses cost more in 2019 than they did in 2008. Expenses have gone up, not down, over the last 11 years. I think we can all agree on that. The second issue we see is that even though the income has crashed 59%, the assessor has only a 6.3% difference between his normal condition and his below normal condition values. No one in their right mind should believe that a 59% crash in gross income would only affect the market value of an apartment building 6.3%. And the third issue is the State Board of Equalization report for Century in 2018 stated that the sales and the income approach are the most relevant approaches to consider for income property. Every appraiser that submitted an appraisal on an older apartment property to this state board in 2018 stated the cost approach does not apply. Yet the assessor used it as his market approach to value for Century apartments, which are 40 years old. I have provided a chart showing that the historical average gross income multiplier for Century is 4.3, not 8. See Century's historical GIM, chart 18. Assessed value divided by actual income each year for the last 15 years. If we take 4.3 GIM times the gross income, $785,147, that equals $3,376,132 for a value. When I capitalize the expenses that were questioned by the assessor and use the assessor's 6.5 cap rate, I get $3,275,000 rounded for a market value. When I stabilize the income and expenses and use a market cap rate of 8%, I get a value of $3,722,000 rounded for market value. Comparable sales show a low of $24,000 per unit and a high of $40,000 per unit for properties like Century, creating a value range of $2.8 million to $4.8 million. When I reconcile all the values, I agree with Joe Eibach and Corey Cost the most noted appraisers in North Dakota, that the value is $3.5 million. And I ask that you correct Century Apartments to its market value of $3.5 million. So how did we get to where we are? The assessor and the owner agreed almost exactly from 2004 through 2013, or 10 years. See the black and purple lines prior to 2014? The assessor missed the turn in the market in 2014, basically going off the rails, and the assessor has not returned. This is the error that created the overassessment issue. In 2015, the assessor increased the value another 30% while income dropped 2.5%. Missing the turn and increasing instead of decreasing created a huge error between the assessed value and the market value. The assessor, after the fact, admitted he had been off by as much as 60%, as proven by actual sales selling at 40% of assessed value. Math error. I believe this same standard or allowable 45% expense factor error was made last year by staff, and that they would have come out with a different value had they used a more appropriate expense factor. But more importantly, I believe a math error was made when doing the gross income multiplier, GIM calculation. It appears staff used the GIM value calculated in the appraisal instead of multiplying staff's effective gross income by the 5.9 GIM calculated from the sales in the appraisal. If one takes the 5.9 GIM and multiplies it by staff's effective gross income of $728,800, one gets $4,299,920, not $5,245,100. That's almost $1 million error in value. Where we are with the corrections. 2017. Century was abated to $4.8 million. 2018, Century was corrected to $5,129,000. Joe Eibach and Corey Cost appraisal puts Century at $3.5 million. I ask you correct Century to its market value and independent appraisal value of $3.5 million for 2019. Thank you. Any questions?